The world in which Scott Young and Boris Berezovsky operated was kind of like going down this rabbit hole. It's a world that exists under the surface, with global business deals and yachts and mansions and celebrity clubs and shady criminal figures. This isn't a world that exists entirely separately from our world. And when it crosses over, it can be potentially lethal.
A murder investigation being launched into the death of another Russian on British soil.
He told his uncle a fortnight before he died, if anything happens to me in the next 2 weeks, it won't be an accident.
Мама, не вернусь, прости, я не один. Пули как грибы, в поле не растут, спущенные штаны меня выдают. Пушки Маузер, гангстер Тайзер, денежки на стол, я этой ночью супервайзер. Время умирать, время выпускать коптил.
London is levitating on a sea of dirty money.
If you deal with somebody who has a very suspicious track record, someday it will come back to haunt you.
Улицы кишат духом враждующих миров. На моем плече набито, я на все готов.
What was your impression of Boris Berezovsky when you first met him?
Very mercurial, I would say. He was never still. He was always on the move. Fast speaking, fast in understanding, very intelligent. When I met Boris, it was in 1972, and then I started to work for him. We spent a lot of time together. He had some kind of energy or some power, or that feeling that he knows what he wants. But at that time, we had no idea of what could happen. I was at Boris Berezovsky's birthday party in 2006. It was in Blenheim Palace, with a lot of music, with a lot of black caviar. It was beautiful. Small party, Russian style. You know, the interesting thing about Russians in London is they don't like to be seen together. But for this party, it was different.
As part of our investigation, we obtained some home video footage of the party, and it's just quite extraordinary to watch all of these characters mingling in, incredible glamour and luxury. There was Berezovsky, Badri Patikatsishvili, Berezovsky's closest associate and business partner. There was Andrei Lugovoy. He'd recently got out of prison, and he'd managed to ingratiate himself with Berezovsky. There was Alexander Litvinenko, the KGB defector who fled to the UK with Boris Berezovsky's help. The guest list really was a who's who of both kind of Russia's most wanted men, but also the glitziest and most glamorous tier of Russian society, which was now exiled to the UK. They were really all there under one roof, circulating together, enjoying themselves on the dance floor, sipping brandy, puffing on cigars. And then we noticed, but that also present was Scott Young. We knew that there was this connection between Scott and Boris, but this video footage of the party showed that Scott Young was connected to a number of politically exposed Russians who'd fled to the UK, and that really seemed like there was a very strong Russian connection to Scott Young. That rang real alarm bells for us. How could that be explained?
С самого начала, когда я сюда приехал, я решил, что я попытаюсь жить жизнью этой страны, а не той, из которой уехал. При этом совершенно это не означает, что я забыл про свою страну, я ее по-прежнему люблю больше всех других стран.
In the 90s in Russia, there was lots of corruption and links with organized crime. It was a very unsettled time.
The barricades aren't coming down yet. They say they'll remain in place until the ideal of democracy in Russia is fully out of danger. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
I was the BBC's Moscow correspondent starting in 1988. At the time, Russia was a very dodgy criminal place. The big step forward was 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. At the time, Russia was led by Boris Yeltsin. His agenda was shaped by the attitude he'd adopted towards the communist system. Overnight, he did away with the old Soviet system and introduced the basic tenets of capitalism.
As Russia moved into its new capitalist economy, Boris Yeltsin sold off all of the assets which had been state-owned, including the country's oil and mineral concerns, all of its media businesses. Cronies of Boris Yeltsin were able to come along and buy up gigantic companies for rock-bottom prices and became billionaires overnight.
You get what was called cowboy capitalism in Russia, and we started to see the oligarchs rise to prominence.
What is oligarch? It's a very rich man who uses his riches for political influence.
I know some of them personally. I grew up with them. Some of them been to prison. They were in the right place at the right time. They've taken over state assets, basically paying them nothing.
Before you know it, you've got someone who's gone from a regular citizen in a communist state to a global billionaire. And not just any global billionaire, a global billionaire with potentially a very mucky history, you know?
When we initially began investigating this, we were looking into the death of Scott Young. But it became increasingly clear to us as we looked into our documents that Berezovsky was the true center of this story. And if we were going to understand what had happened, we needed to understand Berezovsky's past.
So Boris Berezovsky, like Scott, is a rags to riches story. Boris, very humble upbringing, becomes a mathematician, really successful, you know? And then he was in his late 40s, capitalism comes, and the guy became a veritable Russian tycoon. Newspapers, airlines, property, automobile companies, all the classic accoutrements of capitalist success. But obviously, with the Russian twist.
He was absolutely honest and dishonest. At the same time, he was kind and he was evil. And then he became one of the most powerful men in the country.
After 1996, Berezovsky essentially became Boris Yeltsin's grey cardinal. He was the man behind the scenes in the Kremlin. He got a few formal state positions, but his real power was in the way that he could shape the decisions that Yeltsin was taking.
Prime ministers come and go, but Boris Berezovsky survives, the power behind the throne. He's on a mission to spread the creed of capitalism to those the new Russia has left behind.
For most Russians, this was a period of real misery, of real hardship. At the same time, though, as a minute fraction of Russians were becoming obscenely rich, essentially through rigged auctions of state assets being privatized. And Berezovsky took advantage of the situation.
They believe that I'm a person who is able to give them not just hope, but the real way for the future.
What were some of the bureaucratic hurdles that you faced in St. Petersburg?
I know why you're asking this. You're going to ask about how I met Mr. Putin. We had a car dealership, but we had no documents for the land on which it was staying. Without this document, we have nothing. Even with all the political events, it was very hard to get certain documents.
Putin at the time was a fairly kind of grey and anonymous bureaucrat from St. Petersburg when he was there as the deputy mayor.
After 7 months fighting for this piece of paper, and Boris told me that, you know, there is one man in St. Petersburg. You go there, maybe you'll have lunch together. Explain it to him and he will help. I never heard the name of Putin before that. I went to a restaurant. I started explaining to Putin the situation with the land. He listened to me very attentively, then went to the window, spoke for a short time on his mobile, and then told me that, okay, go to this person, you'll get your paper. I was glad to meet you. Bye. I said, well, and lunch? He said, no. You invited me to lunch. You didn't invite me to discuss business. You start to discuss business, there will be no lunch. Glad to meet you, and he left. In 5 minutes, I got the document, went back to Moscow, called Boris and said, Boris, who is this guy? And Boris said, well, you know, he's a very special person.
Yeltsin was old, he was ill, he'd had heart attacks. Berezovsky and the oligarchs were starting to look for a transition to a new president which would not see too much damage for the guys who'd been involved in the old presidency.
I approached Boris in '98, offering him to write his biography. Boris knew that he could trust me, and this was a big deal, and I think that's why he allowed basically me to be around. I became very close with Boris, and he started to take me with him wherever he would travel. At one point, he told me that they found a person who will become next president of Russia.
You know, and so the story goes, the oligarchs are looking about and they're like, who's someone who's really like pliable? We want like a Mr. Nobody, someone like malleable. And then one of them's like, well, how's about this guy, Vladimir Putin? Like, we get him in, he's a functionary, and he'll do whatever we want.
I was very upset. Oh, because the guy was working for KGB all his life. I mean, come on, are there any other Russians around? I mean, it's a huge country. I told him that they're making a major mistake. For Boris, this is an issue of personal security.
Berezovsky thought that the quid pro quo would be that he would maintain a close position within Putin's court, would be an advisor, and really would be a kind of puppet master who could pull the strings on what he thought was this faceless bureaucrat who he hoped would continue to do his bidding.
You can imagine how that turned out. Like, I mean, that fucking blew up in their faces, right?
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin, began to establish the Putin era.
Поэтому я вас всех хочу поблагодарить и поздравить. Это ваш успех.
Лена, мы победили. Представляешь? Вот почему так ты сделал, как вот посчитал нужно. Поставил человека, ты на него посмотрели, что действительно годится.
Посмотрели, годится, и проголосовали за него.
Он плохого человека не поставил.
Да.
Сколько перебирал?
Просмотрел 20 человек за 4 месяца, 20 кандидатур.
Спасибо. Здравствуйте.
Putin gets elected as president, and things change incredibly rapidly after that. He decided, enough of the old ways. I'm going to rid myself of these hangers-on. And in a very dramatic meeting in the Kremlin, he called in all the oligarchs and he said, look, this is the new way things are going to be done.
Ваши ожидания?
It's not going to be you pulling the strings anymore. It's going to be me in charge. If you want to keep your wealth, you keep out of politics. And that means no criticism of me, no financing other political parties, an acceptance that your days as the power behind the throne are over. And if you sign up to all that, then we'll get along just fine. And Berezovsky was the man who really took this as a personal affront.
The power struggle between Berezovsky and Putin started immediately.
Путин стал президентом, и когда я стал ему оппонировать в целом ряде принципиальных действий, которые он осуществлял, он воспринял это как измену ему.
The oligarchs wanted Berezovsky out. No one wanted him to be around. He became a problem.
Мне начали диктовать вот с позиции силы уже, что я должен делать.
As an oppositionist, he was very weak.
Борис Березовский — это кто? Это... Он же... Мы все время говорили, что он бывший секретарь Совета Безопасности, потом бывший кто-то еще. Сейчас он бывший кто? Я Бориса Абрамовича знаю давно. Он неуемный и неугомонный человек. Он всегда кого-то назначает и кого-то свергает.
Putin, of course, had the entire system behind him, including the FSB.
Berezovsky, he was like a man in a barroom fight. He knows he can't win. And his friends are all saying to him, back off, it's not worth it. But he keeps going, and he keeps fighting, because there's something in the Russian character. He felt that there was something more important than wealth. You know, call it honor, call it pride, call it hubris, call it stupidity. He was like a dog with a bone, and he just wouldn't let go. When Vladimir Putin came to power, he had turned into the strong man at the center of power in Russia.
Putin's and Berezovsky's relationship came to a head when there was a catastrophe of a Russian nuclear submarine.
It was the terrible tragedy of the Kursk submarine disaster. There was a terrible accident, an explosion inside a torpedo tube. Sailors were trapped inside this sunk submarine. The Russian fleet did not have the rescue submarines that could have possibly taken the crew out. So they all died. But what made it even worse was that Putin basically played it off as if it was not that important and the families of the submariners shouldn't be giving him a hard time.
Berezovsky's network broadcasted reports.
Таким образом, если бы пресса сообщила раньше, то они предложили бы свою помощь и в субботу, и в воскресенье. А ведь наши еще и 16-го лгали, что у нас все есть и никто нам не нужен.
They were not very complimentary of Putin.
Putin felt that Berezovsky had not just let them down, but that had in some ways declared war by allowing people to highlight the terrible mismanagement of this awful situation.
After that point, Putin really designated Berezovsky an enemy and started to go after him.
There was a time when I'd see him quite often. I was gathering material for my book, and it was my idea to record the conversations.
And Boris Berezovsky, how would you describe yourself as a person?
It's, no one definition is correct.
The thing I liked about these recordings is it was the real Berezovsky. He wasn't putting on a front, he wasn't thinking about what he was going to say, he wasn't doing an interview for television, he was just talking.
Last meeting with Vladimir Putin is exactly what I told him. I never swear that I support you. I swear to support ideas. And if you follow ideas, I will support
then I'll support you.
If you will go against, I will go against. He was very surprised. I said, goodbye forever.
Berezovsky was facing state investigations of several of his companies. The FSB was raiding the head offices of companies that he owned and launching investigations into his business dealings.
The game became very dangerous for Berezovsky. Putin started to claim his power.
They opened the case, they just took my house back. I definitely made mistake in understanding of his character, of his vision of Russia.
Putin warned that oligarchs who stepped out of line in the new Russia would receive a crushing blow on the head.
I got a strong pressure from the state, from General Prosecutor Office. In autumn 2000, I had to leave Russia.
Berezovsky was perhaps the first of the super-rich Russians who settled in London. But from the time Berezovsky came, later on, London became heaven for Russian big money. Business tycoons who were siphoning money out of Russia because their money would not be safe.
They have amounts of money that literally boggle minds, you know what I mean? Like, we're talking about Aladdin's caves of wealth.
It's a very strange environment. Mostly they're bored here. They try to outshine each other. Who has a bigger car, a bigger villa, a bigger this, a bigger that?
I mean, the reason that so many Russian dissidents end up in London is London. It's always been a permissive city. Whether you're bringing in dirty money or you want to go out and you want to drink and do cocaine until 7 in the morning, you can find it here.
It's one of the easiest places in the world to move money, to launder money. Nobody asks you anything.
The issue is trade relations between Britain and Russia. In the past, when Russian companies want to do an IPO, when they want to sell their shares, they're not going to New York to do it. In fact, probably they might not be allowed to. They're coming to London. Like, we're talking about trillions in deals. So the amounts of money that underpin all of this are huge. That's really at the heart of the issue.
For Berezovsky in Russia, money was always a means to an end. But he lost much of his money, I would say, between 80 and 90% of what he had in the process of moving to London. Much of it was expropriated by the Putin government. And so he wanted to make money, obviously.
The British people that hang around the oligarchs, it's a cross-section of society. If you're an oligarch, you want an accountant for your clean money, you know, you get the person who costs £2,000 an hour. But let's say you want to move money that's less clean, you know, well, maybe you go somewhere different, you know, maybe you find somebody who's come up the hard way, you know, who can act as a fixer or a facilitator. Someone like Scott Young, you can understand why they were close, because in many respects they were birds of a feather, you know? They were cut from the same cloth. There are two versions of how Scott met Boris Berezovsky, okay? There's the version that Scott likes to tell, which is he turns up back at his stately home one day, and Michelle runs out and she's like, Scott, there's this weird guy in the house. And he walks into the house And there's this like cannonball-shaped guy sitting in a chair who's like, hey, this is my house now. Turns out this guy's Boris Berezovsky. Within a matter of weeks, Scott had sold him the house. But, you know, there's an alternate history to this.
We have a lot of documentation which suggests that Scott Young had actually met Berezovsky several years earlier in Moscow.
Scott had been doing various favours and facilitations for people in Berezovsky's circle for a number of years. There were a lot of kind of private intelligence reports tracking Scott's relationship with Boris Berezovsky.
From the earliest days of Berezovsky's move to the UK, Scott was his fixer. He was the guy who, first of all, sold him the first property that he moved to. And then Berezovsky started using him as a front to funnel his money into British properties. Scott was finding all kinds of ways to help Berezovsky spend his money in the UK while he was under an international arrest warrant and while many of his bank accounts were suspended.
Scott Young, he's on his uppers financially. He's like, need a deal, right? But he knew how to turn a penny into a pound. You know, like he still had that knowledge, and he knew the people that could help him do it. He's this guy, flees to London, and he needs money. Obviously, like, they were going to do something exceptionally crazy.